Welcome everyone to the closing plenary of the World Congress on Justice with Children. My name is Vijay Ratnam Raman, and I am here today as your host, joining you from Sydney, Australia. Well, what a week it has been. Exchanging ideas, experiences, and voices from across the globe on the topic of access to justice for all children towards non-discriminatory and inclusive child justice systems. Earlier this week, I was reminded of a quote by James Baldwin, the author, who said, "If one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, or the judges. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection the most, and listens to their testimony." And this has been a repeated call this week and a principle that underpins this Congress. That is, we cannot achieve equal access to justice for all children without the involvement of children. So we have been privileged by the presence and the contributions of children and young people before and throughout this week. And this is something that we must continue to foster. Before we get started, a few friendly reminders. Firstly, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens throughout the session to ask your questions and post any comments. This session will be recorded and will be posted on the justicewithchildren.org website. Interpretation is also available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. So please select your preferred language at the bottom of your screen via the button. And we also remind everybody that children and young people are speakers and attendees today. So please refrain from any behavior that compromises the safety and well-being of children and young people. The Congress has a safeguarding policy and a code of conduct, and also a child safeguarding team on call for any concerns. Contact is available through the webpage. And thank you to all of you for helping us to make this Congress a safe and inclusive and supportive space for children and adults alike. Today, we are once again privileged to be joined by the amazing artist, Katie Chappell, and she will be illustrating the closing session live, viewable on your screens throughout. Friends, we are living in a time of monumental change and uncertainty. Throughout this week, we have been reminded that children's access to justice is under threat, whether it be COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, wars and conflict, increasing inequality and discrimination. And so our first session today comes as a bit of a welcome balm. We are very, very lucky to have with us Sanjay Khanna. Sanjay was the first futurist appointed to a global law firm, Baker & McKenzie. Today, he is strategic advisor and foresight expert at Now Partners, an international consulting firm that helps clients design and implement approaches aligned with environmental, social, and governance issues in the context of regenerative economies. Sanjay's work involves futures thinking, to help organizations build resilience by developing strategies in the face of challenges of converging crises. Passionate and deeply engaged in addressing climate change, health, and online harm, Sanjay is also a professor at McMaster University, where he co-teaches digital transformation and strategy. And I cannot think of anyone more qualified to walk us through as we urgently develop strategies to address child justice in these unprecedented times. To start us off, let's watch a video from Robert Muga of the Igarape Institute in Brazil.
My name is Robert Muga. I'm the co-founder of the Igarape Institute in Brazil and SecDev Group in Canada. Our work focuses on the intersection of human, digital, and climate security around the world. Now, in addition to researching issues of security and justice related to young people with the World Health Organization, the UN Population Fund, and the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, I was invited to advise the Youth, Peace, and Security Report for the UN Security Council back in 2020. I'm also advising the UN Secretary General on a range of issues, not least the Common Agenda this year, which promises to drive action across the organization, including for youth, over the coming years. Now, in this short intervention, I want to do just three things. First, I'll quickly highlight some of the risks facing children and youth, from violence and marginalization to exclusion. Next, I'm going to underline the incredible agency of young people and the importance of seeing them as an asset and not a security threat. And finally, I'll close with a few practical suggestions on how to engage young people in questions of security and justice. Now, at the outset, we need to recognize the sheer dimensions of the youth demographic around the world. Right now, there are more than 2.6 billion people under 20 years of age, about a third of all people on the planet. Of these, about 1.2 billion are youth between 10 and 19, and 1.4 billion are under 9. And the key point is that 90% of these young people, they're in the developing world. While more numerous than ever, young people have never been more educated or connected, but they're also facing incredible challenges, from conflict and crime and climate change to digital divides and inequality and poverty. The extent of physical and psychological insecurities facing children and young people is deeply disconcerting. Today, about 1 in 5 young people live in a conflict zone. Roughly 2/3 of all young people suffered from some kind of violent episode every single year. And these categories, these experiences, they're not equal across age groups, genders, or socioeconomic categories. For example, we know that children with lower education from lower income households with existing health challenges and a history of exposure to violence, they tend to be more at risk. Young girls, for example, are significantly more at risk of sexual violence than young boys before they reach the age of 18. The legacy of violence is far-reaching and often radiates far beyond the initial incident. There are violent deaths, of course, but also severe injuries and impaired brain and nervous system development. Added to this are risky behaviors, negative coping strategies, unintended pregnancies, and other pathologies that span generations. Now, violence has both short and long-term impacts that ripple across households and communities, and all of this can affect the political, economic, and social environments in which young people are raised. Violence and related insecurities ultimately inhibit young people from reaching their full potential. Today, about 1 in 5 young people is not receiving any kind of basic education, employment, or training. As a result, many are facing exclusion, marginalization, and are locked out of opportunities, which in turn contributes to mistrust and diminished horizons. And all of this leads to participation and opportunity gaps and deepening frustration and anxiety. Making matters worse, rather than creating incentives and support systems to help, we're seeing some governments characterizing young people as threats. This is expressed most obviously in aggressive policing operations, the lowering of the age of criminal responsibility, mass incarceration, and the placement of young people in adult prisons. There's very little evidence these kinds of tactics achieve their intended outcomes, and ample research suggesting that they actually exacerbate crime, violence, and victimization. The truth, of course, is that the vast majority of young people around the world are not inclined towards violence. To the contrary, young people are extraordinarily resilient and wellsprings of innovation, ideas, and solutions. Around the world, young people are on the front line of peace processes and peace building, criminal justice and penal reform, democratic renewal and revitalization and climate action, and they're connected like never before. So despite the tremendous challenges ahead, young people are surprisingly optimistic. They're actually hopeful about the future. Surveys conducted by the UN in 2020 suggested about a third of all youth believe that life will actually get better by 2050 compared to today. Roughly 9 in 10 see the current moment as an opportunity rather than a threat. Harnessing this positive energy and leveraging it for the future is key. Of course, structural barriers to their full participation exist, but young people, they're stubbornly optimistic all the same. At a time of waning international cooperation between nations, support for multilateral institutions is at a high among young people. A global consultation of over 1.5 million people around the world, including youngsters, many of them under 25, underline their commitment to the UN and other international bodies. But the support of young people is neither inevitable nor guaranteed. Many are growing frustrated with inaction, the slow pace of change. Many are also joining online and offline movements, demonstrating for reform. This is more obvious in the climate movement, but we're also seeing it in other sectors. But the result is that faith in democracies, especially among young people, it can wane as people lose confidence in their elected leaders. So what are we to do? First, we, all of us, need a change of mindset. We need to listen and work with youth rather than securitize them. We need to promote political representation for young people, especially women and girls. And this means challenging social norms and stereotypes. It requires amplifying the voice of young people and doubling down on intergenerational justice. It must result in young people having a seat at the decision-making table. Now, the UN, for its part, is exploring this in very practical terms, including by proposing a dedicated UN office, a youth office in the Secretariat. The UN also intends to step up the office of the Envoy on Youth and establish a special envoy for future generations. The Secretary General himself has promised to initiate more meaningful, diverse, and effective engagement with young people in decision-making. Of course, the goal here isn't just to reform the organization, it's to send a message to member states to do the same. In addition to investing in data-driven, evidence-based violence prevention and reduction, we also need to fundamentally change the opportunity structure for young people. This means first and foremost investing in quality education and opportunity of outcomes. These issues have become urgent, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, with over 90% of young people having had their education disrupted in some kind of way. Even before COVID-19, roughly 260 million children and young people, they weren't even receiving the most rudimentary of educational skills. What's required is a concerted effort to bridge this gap, including in relation to financing. The next priority is decent and sustainable employment. Young people are too often sidetracked into the informal sector with low-paying jobs and insecure jobs. Reskilling and upskilling youth is critical, as are strategies to ensure engagement in low-emission, climate-friendly labor markets. Youth labor guarantees are critical, as is a commitment to intergenerational equity. Look, we're facing extraordinarily complex, interconnected, and accelerating challenges on our horizon globally. Young people are going to have to deal with these. They need to be equipped with the skills and discretion to address them. This begins with ensuring safety and security, but requires a multidimensional engagement that builds resilience for the long term.
Hello, I'm just going to reflect on Robert's comments and bring up my presentation. Just one moment, please. Thank you, Vijaya, for your introductory remarks, and to Robert for providing the video. There's a lot to reflect on in Robert's comments, and now we have to think about plausible futures of child justice, and the session is focusing on futures of child justice, and notice the plural, because we're going to talk about a methodology called scenario planning that uses an evidence-informed approach to develop conceptual futures as we think ahead about the future of child justice. In this case, we've developed a couple of scenarios to 2025, and we'll talk about that a bit. But we're doing this in the service of trying to protect the sacred trust that children and young people have in us to help to secure their future, to provide the contexts within which there can be healthy psychosocial and material development in their lives. So that's sort of the context for this. And I was brought into this project, which is very much a team effort by Angela Vahil of Baker McKenzie. We were formerly colleagues at Baker McKenzie. And it's my honor to present to you. And let me first thank you, all of you, for your work on behalf of children and youth in contact with and in conflict with the law. I'm speaking in Canada, in Toronto, from the traditional territories of Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples. And so the voice of youth and marginalized Indigenous youth is also clearly part of this broader discussion on the future of child justice. So I'll begin by sharing the process that we've used to look at this context of converging crises and the implications for child justice. Again, there are many people, including my teachers, who've taught me over the years to really look to future generations in my work. And so I'd like to thank everyone who has taught me in my life and career to respect children's voices and to treat children with dignity and respect and as co-equals and co-creators of the future. So let me just introduce this project to you by sharing a bit of a story. So this is me in 1969. I'm 4 years old and I'm with my grandfather. And the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is below 350 parts per million, which is seen to be the level of carbon dioxide you want in the atmosphere to preserve conditions for a more predictable future of the change of the natural world. And so when I was 4, it was 324 parts per million. When my son was 8 years old in 1997, he's there on the right-hand side of the screen, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was over 350 parts per million at 364 parts per million CO2. And now we're at 413.93 parts per million CO2. That was the monthly average in October 2021. And you can see in the bottom left of the screen how things have gone sort of from green from an atmospheric standpoint to orange to this constant red that we see. And COP26 has just finished, and you saw the strong voices of children and youth from around the world working mostly in side events to contribute to the process. And youth and all of us in our civilizations face something called climate departure. And for different cities around the world, it will be at different times, but you'll notice this climate departure will occur in some countries in the 2020s, in others in the 2030s, and some later. But the concept of climate departure is that after this date, the temperature moves out of historical variability completely, and you move into an entirely different climate regime, where the coldest year on average in that future climate will be hotter than the hottest year on average in the 1860 to 2005 temperature record. So we're in an era of unprecedented risk. And this slide shows the color high risk red. And these are different gradations of that color high risk red that we're living through. So none of the areas in the converging crises era are not in some shade of red as a background condition. So we become habituated to an environment of unprecedented risk. And if some of you in the child justice community are feeling as if you've been repeating the same things over and over to get the message through about how to adapt to global change and how to serve children's rights and justice, it's in part the sense of being stuck because we become habituated to this risk environment. It's very hard for messages to get through power structures and other kinds of structures. So in this era of converging crises, we're talking about socioeconomic reordering, technological acceleration, both the good and bad around technological shifts, population and planetary health, geopolitical fragmentation, and environment and climate change. And all of those have some negative impacts. We're seeing a long-term impact on population and planetary health as chronic illnesses grow and as the impacts of climate change and other socioeconomic issues grow. And you'll see that these are all interconnected, as all of you know in your work. So the question is, in the context of converging crises, how might these converging crises plus climate change affect human experience and the futures of child justice? When I was the futurist in residence of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, I had the privilege of speaking to the cellist Yo-Yo Ma. And he was talking about how the word disruption is used over and over and over again in the newspapers and in media. But then there's the disruptor and the disrupted. There are people who get disrupted by disruption and those who are causing disruption or engaging in activities that correlate with that. And he said, when you constantly hear the word disruption, you know you're not living in a safe world. And that's the context for children and all of us who are allies of children. And in this context, who will and who should you trust in the era of convergent crises, an era of unprecedented risk? And the problem with the word unprecedented is it's the last word you can use to describe the risk. We don't have another word. So next year, the Congress, you'll say, or the next Congress, you'll say the risk is unprecedented. But we need to be very specific and focused and descriptive when we talk about what we mean by the specific kind of unprecedented risks that we face. And what might happen if the child justice community does not understand the convergent crises context and how that context should inform supporting child justice. It means there would be significant blind spots. So this foresight, scenario planning, this work, I think is part of leadership in times of crisis, and all of you are leaders. How do we use foresight in this process to improve early recognition, to make sense of the context, to make meaning of the context, to communicate more effectively, to enhance learning and resilience? And for some of you, in my role, that's what I do. I focus on those sort of 6 areas, but many of you are focused on making critical decisions, orchestrating vertical and horizontal coordination, coupling and decoupling, and rendering accountability. And those are all part of this sort of leadership as well. So the field of strategic foresight comes into play, where it was developed to look at the turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous conditions we face, which are all part of a context of radical uncertainty. And the Oxford scenario planning approach that we used as part of this scenarios on the future of children's justice to 2025, this approach is really about being evidence informed in how one develops the scenarios, but making them useful and usable and valuable by organizations. And what we do is we look at the contextual environment that we cannot change and how it impacts the transactional environment in which we engage. And so how are we going to reorient ourselves because of the changing environment in our transactional environment? And what we want to do with this is really look at our perception. How do we perceive the context we're in? How do we look at the facts and trends that might bend, and then look at those facts and trends in a broader context, and then use those contrasting scenarios or conceptual futures to try to understand and reperceive where we are today in relation to what we might imagine could occur plausibly, using evidence and informing it with evidence. And the process that we used is iterative. It's to look at the scenarios and then reperceive the environment and go through a process of reperceiving and reorienting and reframing the context we're in, so we can develop better strategy in the here and now on behalf of child justice. We look at questions of time. What is the future coming towards us? Where are we sitting in terms of the present going forward? And what are the things that we didn't mitigate earlier from the past that are catching up to us now and have perhaps deepened or developed a great deal of momentum behind them? And so they're very, very challenging to deal with. And many of you will be paying attention to various issues from the past that have been raised by the child justice community that if they were mitigated earlier, we'd be in a better position today to address them. So what we're looking at is developing a hypothetical scenario set that's plausible, challenging, memorable, and useful. These are well-researched, well-developed opinions about the future, according to Dr. Rafael Ramirez of Oxford University. And one of the things we do in the scenario practice is inform scenarios with interviews. So here you'll meet some of the people who informed the interviews. There were about 25 people who were part of this interview process. And we inform scenarios with evidence on socioeconomic reordering, tech acceleration, physical and mental health, geopolitical fragmentation, environment, and climate change. Issues such as wealth and income inequality that's accelerating post-pandemic, or as we go through the pandemic, it's clearly in force still. Vaccine, slow rollouts of vaccines and the divergence of economic development globally. The rise of displacement that's occurring, with the United States being in the top 10 of countries for people displaced, and in their case by climate disasters, environmental disasters. And this issue of transition, energy transition, will it be orderly or disorderly? It's looking like at this moment it's going to be more disorderly than orderly. The long-term implications for individual and collective health and emotional and social functioning as a result of the pandemic. These are also bits of evidence we would consider. The mental stress of COVID being longer term and continuing today and moving forward that could affect societal resilience. The impact of climate change and drought and other issues on youth. We've had a major climate disaster in Canada that affected an agricultural basin, but this is taking a psychological toll on youth as they consider their future. And then, of course, the new geopolitical conflicts around water that are emerging around water and other resources, kind of a scramble that could occur as part of the deglobalization process that we also need to pay attention to because it can affect child justice. Then under this geopolitical context, how about the universal transboundary threats and how we collaborate? In this context, it becomes harder to collaborate. And of course, as we understand climate change more, we're getting more precise about understanding the ways in which those changes affect human physical and mental health, food security, water availability, infrastructure, and other facets of life on Earth. And you'll see from all these trends I mentioned, they all sort of converge and coalesce and amplify and touch each other. So in a time of converging crises, we have to think about synergistic solutions. So in this project, I was asked by the Global Initiative on Justice with Children to come to this plenary to develop some scenarios on the future of children's justice to 2025. We used expert interviews, youth interviews, academic research, developed scenarios we're presenting today. And then what we will do is take feedback from this session, iterate the scenarios further, and then hand the scenarios over to the Global Initiative on Justice with Children. In terms of youth agency, which Robert Maga mentioned, these are some of the comments from youth that came from our youth interviews around deep uncertainties. Will the digital divide expand or contract? How much will technology reduce harmful impacts of COVID and climate change? Which innovations will promote youth justice? AI can potentially be objective and reduce court backlogs, but it can't replace humans and might infringe on our rights. Online documents speed up justice administration. With the global pandemic, will we reduce punitive approaches or use them more so that punitive versus restorative justice? Treatment of ethnic minorities and vulnerable communities. Will convergent crises finally lead to state and global support to protect the most marginalized or make their situation worse, leading to additional suffering and deaths? Unemployment and youth mental health. How do we address the constant stress youth face because of the lack of availability of jobs? And youth perspectives, even when youth recognize older generations' valuable experience and knowledge, where can we place youth perspectives front and center where appropriate? And these were comments that came from our youth interviews with the advisory committee that's part of this global initiative. So we developed two scenarios on the future of children's justice. One was called fragmented energy, where the climate crisis grows, political, social, technology challenges proliferate. There's a kind of fragmented energy among children's rights stakeholders to address common and differentiated challenges. And then a second one called gathering forces, where the climate crisis grows, political, social, tech challenges proliferate, and forces gather among children's rights stakeholders to address common and differentiated challenges. And the deep uncertainties we looked at in this project were COVID-19 impacts on children's justice systems, resiliency of children's rights frameworks, response of governments, NGOs, child advocates, justice systems, and society, and of course, the capacity to think ahead effectively. If we've been compromised by the constant stress of the COVID pandemic and responding to child justice issues within that context, are we able to build our capacity to think well when we're thinking under such stress? So children's justice to 2021, the first scenario, fragmented energy, I'll describe it in a bit more detail before we get our first contributions from our two initial panelists. So in this first scenario, fragmented energy, converging crises worsen to 2025, nationalist movements rise in support of hardline policies on immigration and internal migration. Although climate change and political conflict result in soaring rates of child refugees in overcrowded detention centers, governments accord low priority to protecting immigrant children in the face of unprecedented floods, drought, fires, and storms citizens face. And the child justice system is overwhelmed. And you'll note we're at 424 parts per million CO2 in this scenario in 2025. Prison and juvenile detention reforms regress as viral disinformation campaigns spread radicalized fears of dangerous criminal youth and migrants. Stretched by external circumstances, children's rights organizations speak more loudly and forcefully as governments continually fail to implement the UNCRC, and marginalized children and youth are highly impacted worldwide. Novel and complex issues flood the courts as the pandemic eases. Justice systems struggle to address societal needs with unprecedented volumes of family, immigration, and criminal-related legal matters. And lived justice is digitally preserved. There are such concerns in this context that legal and experience-based precedents could be lost to extreme weather events and government erasure. Advocates launch a global effort to create and fund a permanently accessible and disaster-resilient data repository of evidence-based interventions in respecting children's justice. So that is the first scenario, and now we move to the expert in youth response from Ton Liefard, Professor of Children's Rights at Leiden Law School, and Angela Vasile, a Child Youth Advisory Group member and graphic designer based in Romania. Welcome, Angela and Ton, and Ton, I invite your feedback as I stop to share the screen.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for this introduction and for giving us, Angela and myself, the task to reflect on this first scenario on fragmented energy. I thank the organizers and congratulate everyone for a remarkable week and a truly international gathering. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you together with Angela. And Angela, I don't know, some of you may remember that, but Angela broke into the final plenary of the 2018 World Congress in Paris. And she broke in order to make the child's voice heard. And yet we are in a different time frame. And we have Angela as one of our panelists. But not only that, Angela has also been a driving force behind this whole World Congress. So that is what I would call progress. And I look forward very much to the conversation, Angela, that you and I will have in the next 10 minutes. The first scenario presented to you today, I think, is painting a rather grim picture of the years ahead of us. But I'm afraid it's a plausible scenario. It's a scenario that is very likely, in fact. Despite the progress that has been made since roughly the 1980s, when the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted. And a lot of progress has been built around this momentum coming with the United Nations Convention. And that momentum was pushed for by the activities and the relentless efforts of many: civil society, lawyers, courts, leaders within courts, governments, even ombudspersons, and also academics. And above all, also more and increasingly so, the inclusion of young people in the conversation, in reaching out with solutions. Undeniable progress. And children's access to justice has been part of that progress. And it's on the international agenda, together with other fundamental issues, including the protection of children against all forms of violence, the eradication of extreme poverty, equal access to quality education, and also the protection of children deprived of liberty. And these are just a few of the major achievements, I think, collectively, and also with impact. Yet, and I think it was mentioned also by Sanjay, COVID-19 and its long-lasting impact on children and families has pushed us back, has pushed reform back, and has also put children's rights to the test. It should make us realize that we are in fact not in a comfortable position. Challenges are big and the stakes are high, and there's much to lose. And I think it's not unlikely, in fact, it's quite plausible, that the current pandemic, together with the global challenges that were already mentioned around environment and climate, around austerity, around racism, discrimination and exclusion, is confronting us with tasks that may even be too big, overwhelming and discouraging. But it comes with a task that is also having the potential of dividing us and fragmenting our energy. And in light of this, it doesn't really help that the human rights movement, and children's rights are part of that, is under constant threat. The rise of populism and the emergence of illiberal democracies and authoritarian leaders, dictators also, result in questioning explicit, but sometimes also in implicit ways, the relevance and value of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And international cooperation and collaboration intergovernmentally around human rights, the rule of law and access to justice is not self-evident anymore. It is already suffering from significant pushbacks. And it was already happening before COVID-19 saw the light. In my view, I think the COVID-19 pandemic shows us very clearly the complete lack of international solidarity from the governments in protecting the rights and interests of individuals, including children, in particular the most vulnerable ones, immigrants, young women and girls, children with disabilities, children with mental health needs and suffering from moral injuries, children belonging to minorities, children deprived of liberty. COVID-19 responses by government, in fact, in many countries also disconnected generations by giving priority to one generation over the other. In a way, it gave some kind of justification for being over-focused on yourself and to draw back safely behind your own borders, pushing back the others. Again, breeding ground for fragmented energy, standing in the way of also using the great potential the 21st century has. Great potential in the sense that we can benefit from so much more, collectively, so much more than before, including many, many technological opportunities. Zooming in on access to justice, one of the biggest and most important challenges, in my view, to secure a joint focus on equitable justice for all children. Access to justice is, in other words, a vehicle. It's important to use that to overcome the justice gap. The justice gap standing in the way of recognizing that each individual child is, above all, a child with human rights and fundamental freedoms. And if we recognize this and if we use access to justice as a vehicle, we are also getting closer to accountability, because that accountability of governments, state actors, but also of non-state actors, business, civil society, service providers, is really what could help us to close that gap and to bring back that energy again in a collective way. Access to justice, in my view, is a vehicle to secure a common narrative around children's rights protection in face of all the challenges that Sanjay was referring to and I mentioned before. but it's also helping us to secure generations justice, access to justice for generations to come, in order to make it a truly intergenerational phenomenon. That would be my reflection on this first scenario, which is quite grim again. And I wonder, Angela, how you look at that from your perspective.
Thank you, Tom. Indeed, unfortunately, what you shared with us, it is the reality of things. But there is hope, because, as you said, the government pushed us away, broke generations. But the population, the people, the community show the fact that if we work together, if we took all these fragmented energies that each one of us have, little by little, we can work together and change the future. The young persons that until now discussed about climate change, children's rights, and other topics, try to use their voices to prevent something like this to happen, to let the adults in power know that this can happen at any moment. But because they were too young in those persons' perspective, they weren't listened to. They had a voice, but it was ignored. And unfortunately, in this kind of situation, those persons in power, I hope they understood that a fresh perspective shown and shared by the younger generation is something that can change easily a situation. And if society is working together, even if the government is trying to break us, to fragment us, as the title says, we can still work, we can still do changes. If we think about the COVID situation, even if most of us sometimes were unable to go outside and do basic things, for example, the elderly in my country had a period of time where they couldn't go outside. So other persons, younger persons from the society, decided to step up, even if the government was not allowing, and volunteer to help those persons. That's something that can be used in any kind of situation, including justice. If we, one by one, start to speak up, to learn more about the rights of children, if children have the chance to discuss more about this, to learn more about this, to have more information in a school environment, for example, about this, they can came up with new perspective, with new ideas, that, and in the future, this grim situation that we live through right now can bloom. It can be better. We are in a situation right now where we can go. We are at the bottom of the line. We can only go up. So that's what we need to do. We need to gather everything and think and help each other, no matter the age, no matter the level of education, and learn from each other, listen to each other, and connect and work with each other.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. I think this is a very hopeful message that comes from you, and you are representing what has been referred to as the generation without borders. The Canadian General Romeo Dallaire uses that all the time, and he says there is a great potential there because the younger generation is much more connected. So there, if you get the energy there, if you take it from there, then it's already connected.
Tom,
yeah.
I was just going to say that I thought we could maybe, if you could wrap up, then we can build on Angela's comments in the next scenario. Thank you.
Absolutely. So it's a hopeful picture. That's what I wanted to say. And creativity comes with it, and bottom up, Angela. So what would be your suggestion to the other panelists here? How can we move forward?
Well, in my opinion, we need to join together, as I said. Our energy might be fragmented, but together we can create something big and powerful, like a mosaic or like a puzzle. You see, all these little pieces together can form a bigger picture, and connecting all these fragmented energies, we can gather forces and join in creating something bigger.
That's wonderful, and as the audience can see, we could spend a lot of time on this scenario and building on these ideas and insights to think about how to develop a serious strategy from the child justice community to impact child justice. So thank you very much, Ton and Angela. That was wonderful. I'm now going to quickly share the screen, describe the next scenario, and then get a response from Barry Goldson and Alexandra Dan. One moment, please. Sorry, I'm having an issue here with getting to full screen. So our second scenario for which we'll get commentary is called Gathering Forces. And here convergent crises also worsen to 2025. And on the right, you see a photograph from the UNICEF report on the impact of climate change on children around the world. Here, the background conditions worsen overall. There's stretched capacities for delivering youth and child welfare impacted by the pandemic. NGOs, children's advocates, international agencies focused on protecting children's rights decide that in light of the converging crises we've talked about earlier, in terms of rise of family conflict, issues with law enforcement, justice systems, child violence, education shortfalls, and heightened risks of abuse, that there will be this gathering of forces that Angela and Ton referred to. And forces here gather for child justice. Constitutional law centers and youth justice advocacy groups build legal grounds for children's rights, giving teeth to the UN resolution recognizing the universal right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We see that we're again at 424 parts per million CO2, so that background condition worsens in both scenarios. And a wary relationship develops with technology, balancing concerns about embedded racism and systemic bias with potential advantages of using data analytics and algorithms to facilitate identification of children and youth at risk for abuse. And here we see true global leadership. The inclusion of children's rights in nation-state constitutions counteracts the growing influence of right-wing populist leaders by enhancing humanitarian capacity and standards for meeting the needs of vulnerable children, youth, caregivers impacted by converging crises. Built with significant contributions from youth activists, new programs reduce police violence against racialized children and youth. And now we invite Barry Goldson, Professor Emeritus, University of Liverpool, and Alexandra Dan, a member of the Child Youth Advisory Group, to respond to these scenarios. And you have actually, sorry, a little bit less time than we had hoped, maybe 3 or 4 minutes each, and then we'll move to the final panel contribution. Hello, welcome Barry, and welcome Alexandra. Who would like to kick off their response?
I think I'm going to start on for us, and I'll just begin by noting, or stating the obvious really, if I may, is that the challenge of imagining the future of child justice at a global level, whilst also taking account of the crises that Robert's video and Sanjay's presentation, together with Ton and Angela's conversation, have outlined, is a truly formidable task, especially within 12 minutes or so. But in order to help us, we've received gratefully the fragmented pieces that Angela and Ton have passed to us, and we've added those to the bricolage of gathering forces. It's also helpful in addressing this formidable task to recall that we are not, of course, operating in year zero. And as Henrietta Fore, the Executive Director of UNICEF, reminded us in the opening plenary on Monday, some of the most striking deficits and misguided rationales that routinely characterize child justice systems across the world are not new problems. In fact, they have long histories. So I want to begin, if I may, by proposing that in order to understand the present and indeed to begin to imagine the future, we first need to take account of the past and to draw on and apply the lessons that our collective histories can provide. In this sense, gathering forces have been fermenting for many decades, and it is time for us to apply them and to put them to work in the service of securing justice for, and indeed justice with, all of the world's children. Now, one of the most striking lessons that can be drawn from our collective histories relates to the curious tendency to repeatedly produce and reproduce system responses that are deeply problematic. In other words, modes of intervention that not only fail to obtain justice for children and with children, but also impose multiple harms by exacerbating the very problems that they supposedly aim to resolve. Given the restrictions of time, and Sanjay has just reminded us of that, I want to briefly focus on two such responses. First, the low minimum age of criminal responsibility that obtains in many jurisdictions around the world. And second, the practices of penal detention, child imprisonment, that are evident, albeit in varying degrees, in all of the world's so-called child justice systems. Wherever we may care to look in the world, and whatever point in history we choose to fix our gaze, child justice systems are typically populated by the most disadvantaged, distressed, and damaged children and young people who are and have been repeatedly failed in the infrastructure of their everyday lives. So to expose such children at very early ages to systemic forms of intervention through which they are labeled, censored, stigmatized, sanctioned, and ultimately punished is simply not justice. Indeed, historical records and international evidence consistently point to the harmful and iatrogenic effects of criminalizing children at such early ages. And there are indeed gathering forces across the broadest range of academic disciplines and institutions, NGOs, statutory organizations, and international agencies that call for the minimum age of criminal responsibility to be significantly raised. The polar end of the very same systems, the deep ends, if you will, the penal detention of children simply has to stop. Again, both historical and contemporary international evidence is compelling. Historical records pertaining to the penal detention of children are replete with failings, scandals, abuses, harms, miseries, and utterly counterproductive outcomes. To paraphrase the great French intellectual Michel Foucault, child imprisonment is dangerous when it is not useless. And contemporaneous gathering forces also continue to signal the need to radically reduce and ultimately to abolish the penal detention of children. By way of examples, the very first recommendation of the UN Global Study on children deprived of liberty pertaining to the administration of justice urges every nation state to develop, and I'm quoting, to develop and implement a national strategy aimed at replacing the detention of children in penal facilities with non-custodial solutions. Now, of course, if we're to take account of the gathering forces that have evolved through our histories and have arguably now reached their most vital juncture, as illustrated so powerfully by Robert's video and Sanjay's scenarios, we will need to radically reshape and reconfigure child justice systems as we move towards our collective futures. And on that note, I'll hand over to my colleague, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Barry. The current conditions require us to gather forces and find immediate solutions for children and young people that are in contact with the law, and these solutions should respond clearly to the children's needs. To support the previous proposals on raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility and replacing criminal detention for children, I suggest the wider implementation of restorative justice and practices among the world states due to its major facilities, such as restorative justice allows the offender and the victim to forgive each other and, in case of the victim, to better understand why the offender acted in a certain way. The place where they meet is decided by the two parts of the process, in a place where they feel comfortable, not like in a courtroom where both the victim and the offender have a sort of discomfort due to the formal practices inside the court. The distinction between the good child and the bad child is removed so that we should see the offender as a child with problems who needs help and support in order to have a normal life and to not become a recidivist. In the case of sending the young offenders to prison, there is a chance that they do not understand their crime and come in contact with other young people in trouble who may determine them to remain in the sphere of offending. If we consider restorative practices, there is a great chance for the young offenders to understand what they did as they communicate with the victim and transpose themselves into his or her situation and empathize with his or her trauma, but also they can forgive themselves for their crime. Restorative practices are also beneficial for situations where children are not the offenders of a crime, but are part, for example, in the process of divorce of their parents, or are witnesses or victims in a trial, because what matters for children and young people is to be offered a comfortable space in which they can express themselves and not just be ignored, because it is possible that in such moments, those children and young people can take a wrong decision or feel abandoned. However, there are also some issues in the case of restorative justice that may not allow us to benefit from its immediate effects in the current pandemic crisis and future environmental crisis. For example, in some states, such as Romania, and not only, it is not allowed the mandatory implementation of restorative justice in certain domains because the constitution of that state itself considers such practices as optional and alternative methods of justice cannot be imposed, so that the restorative practices cannot be suggested as a stage before the trial to see if the parties can reconcile. Another problem is that restorative justice can be used only to the extent that the victim and the offender want to meet voluntarily. So in this case, we can no longer see it as a solution if we want to eliminate the juvenile prison. Although when we propose a solution and want to implement it, we run into different problems and barriers, there is always the chance to find a solution together if we gather forces. And now I hand back the word to Barry.
Thank you, Alexandra and Barry, for your comments and for bringing this idea of reframing the scenarios so that we can think about how do we develop strategy moving forward, who are the new stakeholders we might engage with to make ourselves more successful in this context. And I hope that both of you found this process to be a useful exercise that we can further after, in 2022, bring to actual strategy development and convene the right stakeholders to bring in even more perspectives to this process. So thank you both.
Sanjay, if I just may interject, there naturally more to say and we've been cut short, but I personally think it's very important that the final word goes to Alexandra in view of the Congress's imperative to secure justice with children. So can I just ask for 1 or 2 more minutes for Alexandra to wrap up the...
I think it'll be challenging because we have 2 more speakers and we have about 8 more minutes, but Alexandra, can you make a closing remark? I'd love it if you did. That'd be fantastic.
Okay. So a scenario can often show us a more pessimistic view of the future in which we cannot find a way out of the impasse created by the pandemic or the ecological crisis. What a scenario cannot take into account is the power of children and young people who are determined to change something in the world and who do not see what the barriers are. It may be difficult to persuade the world state to raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility, to abolish child detention, or to implement restorative justice, but you are present today at this Congress, which was created in collaboration with determined young people and adults involved in helping children and young people. You are listening to us now and you find it interesting what we say, and the simple fact that you question the current justice system is a beginning for our actions, because we can convince you to join us in our quest to unite fragmented pieces, and we will able to gather forces to succeed in changing the status quo of children who come in contact with the law. I'm not saying it won't be hard, but what matters is to think at solutions and take action, not just to pity and feel sorry for the disadvantaged children, because in this way we won't change anything. These scenarios are designed precisely so that we do not get to the point where we can do nothing. They are designed to determine us to implement change and find immediate solutions to current problems. So I invite you to make this puzzle with solutions and to gather forces so that this Congress does not remain only with words, but will determine our next actions. And thank you very much for the supplementary minutes.
No, thank you. And thank you both for your contribution. And we look forward to more when this is done. And finally, please let me introduce our final panelists who will speak to exploring child justice scenarios in a global context. And unfortunately, our two panelists will only have 2 or 3 minutes, and they deserve much more time than that. But may I please invite Alexandra Sousa Martins, coordinator from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, who's leading the global program to end violence against children. And then Maria Luciana Exente, responsible AI and AI for Good lead, will speak for 2 or 3 minutes as well as we come to our conclusion. Apologies, Alexandra, for the short amount of time. Look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers for this incredible initiative, the World Congress on Justice with Children. And thank you, Sanjay, for giving me the floor. So I think that I would like to speak about our visions for a desirable or probable future of child justice, and the need, when doing so, to take a look at the obstacles we face today. So I think we are all very much aware of the challenges that justice systems all over the world face, and we can mention lack of data and information. We can mention the lack of a long-term investment in specialized justice systems. We can mention punitive approaches, and throughout this week, all of these challenges have been mentioned by speakers and participants. Tough on crime approaches that have made a comeback in many countries and regions all over the world, including for children. The over-reliance on child detention that was stressed by the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty. We know the challenges. However, I would like to mention that of many challenges that we usually discuss, we often forget an important one, and that is the temptation of giving into the demands of our fast-paced environment and society. We rely too much on quick fixes and solutions for very complex issues. And the truth is, because we often perceive speed as being connected with efficiency. It's the end goal of our economies, and it's therefore our social lives as well. And the faster we become, the more we are intolerant to processes that we see as inconveniences. COVID-19 pandemic and related crises have further exacerbated the vulnerabilities of children and contributed also to this trend. It is incredible how technology has helped us to move fast. But this is also happening in the child justice systems all over the world. And I would like to mention the latest developments that aim to provide quick solutions and increase our efficiencies. And this is virtual hearings, which of course are meant to reduce delays and make justice more accessible to children. But we need to ask ourselves, should we take decisions that can dramatically impact the lives of children without taking the time to meet them in person or speak with them and listen to them? We have to ask ourselves if a Zoom meeting is really conducive to understanding who that person is and what is the potential of that person when in contact with the justice system. I ask myself, if we start virtual hearings, what other processes are we going to move to the virtual space for convenience? And here, my fear is, in the interest of responding to the demands of our fast-paced environments, in the interest of perceived efficiency, we are giving up on humanity. And this is what is happening also to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We pay attention to a loved and flagrant violation of child rights. Children starve, children are beaten, children are tortured, but we often tend to pay less attention to the more silent threat that child rights are often reduced to a discourse, a narrative, instead of becoming the future for children that member states envisioned when they adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have an easy way out. We live in a reality where it's fully possible to come up with processes that nominally respect children's rights. But the danger is, when we reduce rights to nominal procedures, we do not need to violate them anymore, because we have reduced them to an empty shell of what we once hoped they would represent, by taking away their meaning, their power, while pretending to fully respect them. So to conclude, the crisis we are facing, being it COVID in the past 2 years, being the climate crisis, the security and financial crisis that many countries all over the world are facing, represent an unprecedented opportunity for reflection and change. I may have painted a dark picture of the future of child justice, but I would like to insist that we all have good reasons to be hopeful. There can be power in unexpected places. There is power in the voices of children. They have reclaimed the climate change agenda with the power of those who have the most to lose. And while they have tireless road ahead of them, they are making us all listen. It's more difficult to foresee change like this in the context of child justice, we have to acknowledge, because justice systems are very complex. They're often designed to discourage those who lack legal knowledge or means. They are designed to intimidate and to empower norms over people. They are difficult to access. So if the justice system of the future is to provide real opportunities to children, we have to think that change needs urgently to happen. We need to ensure multi-stakeholder action happens, making child rights a priority, ensuring that child rights is integrated, but for real, into developmental efforts and any response to the current crisis, such as, for example, socio-economic recovery plans. We have to be smart enough to identify the champions who are committed to make change happen and establishing new and creative alliances. We must address efforts to strengthen state and non-state actors to recognize the urgency of this matter and to address efforts towards the same direction. But we also need to improve social norms and behaviors, because we need to discuss also the basics, what it means to be a child. What do we mean by childhood, and what are our goals when it comes to treating children with humanity and respect, as we tend to say? So, because regardless of our advances, truth is that we still look at children as mini adults. When they do not conform to this idea, then we tend to focus on discipline, punishment, any means to ensure that they start playing by our rules, that they bend to our conception of the world. The Convention on the Rights of the Child instead emphasized the importance of developmental processes, and development requires relentless questioning, including of social norms. Children naturally know how to do this very efficiently. So let's slow down so that we make enough space to be available to children, provide the help they may need to understand and access the justice process. I would like us all to think about the need to slow down so that we can take the time to listen to them and make changes according to what they need, instead of looking for solutions to ensure that they just become like us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And let me turn it over to Maria Accente, who's the responsible AI and AI for Good lead at PwC in the United Kingdom. Perhaps, Maria, you
I'll
could.
be short. I'll
Yeah.
be very
no,
short.
I just want to say your work would be just fantastic to hear some remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. While everyone was talking, I was reflecting that everything I've heard today could be made much, much worse by the algorithm. And while the topic cannot be covered in 2-3 minutes, not even in 1 hour, what I want to do is actually invite you all to attend the UNICEF Global Forum on AI for Children that's organized only in 2 weeks' time. I'll share the link, where we'll be discussing on one hand how AI is now disrupting the life we know it, how AI is being used in places where children spend their time, in schools, in games online, but also in places that create a context of safety, in justice, in child benefit, in immigration, and also what are the risks and opportunities that AI poses for not just for the children of the present, but the children in the future. And when I look at the scenarios, very much the idea that AI will, or the self-learning algorithm will augment the existing inequality, will augment existing divide. And there is a call for urgent action for all of those who build and use those technologies, not only to prioritize the needs and rights of the children, but also to go and re-engineering or assess how the tools that are currently in use in social media, in education platforms, in social services, in immigration can harm the children, not just on short term, but long term. So, well, as I said, we don't have time to go into details. Please join us in 2 weeks' time for the Global Forum on AI for Children to hear about the work we're doing with UNICEF, with the World Economic Forum, with big private companies and governments around the world, to understand that there is a hope, there is potential for AI to actually correct many of the issues we have at the moment, for AI to address and solve some of the Sustainable Development Goals and help the children flourish in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, and apologies you didn't have the time that was originally allotted. Both you and Alexandra. So I'll conclude now that there's a great opportunity for the Justice with Children Global Initiative to bring its values to life even further in the years ahead, in developing scenarios and strategies together to address the challenges, to build a reframe strategy, build social capital, co-create value in the here and now, and to use foresight methods to improve children's rights praxis, and to build global partnerships, and through that to build social resilience. There's some questions. I think the main one is how do you redefine child-centered justice as the tuna context, this context of radical uncertainty, impacts the heart of children's experience, cognition, mental and physical health, and material circumstances. Use these future thinking methods and collaborations among all of you who've participated in this to support access to justice and child participation in informal and formal justice systems as convergent crises unfold. Understand which futures thinking methods and tools best support global, regional, and local needs. Explore novel ethical and moral dilemmas that technological acceleration and the climate crisis pose for child justice. And finally, initiate new partnerships among child justice stakeholders to stay adaptive and agile in the face of radical uncertainty. And with that, we conclude this session. We're very grateful for all the participants today. And thank you very much, Vijaya, for your acting as Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and thank you to all of our panelists, and our deepest apologies for cutting the time short. There's so much to share. We're going to check in with Katie a little later on, but you can look on your screen. She has been continuing drawing and illustrating all of the discussions that have been happening. Friends, we are going to now take what we have learned during the Congress and the previous session into our next session, entitled Action in Access to Justice. What's next? Spearheading this important discussion is Marielza Oliveira. Marielza is the Director for Partnerships and Operational Program Monitoring, Communications and Information at UNESCO. She has been the Director of UNESCO Beijing and the Global Results Manager for UNDP, where she also held positions as Country Manager across Latin America. Marielza, over to you. And I just ask that all of the panelists, unfortunately, we're running short of time, so please keep your speeches truncated. Thank you so much, Marielza.
Thank you, Vijay. This is a real honor. Let me start by saying, a big hello across the world to all our participants. And in the interest of time, let me just say that we finally come to a session that really, takes us from imagination to reality. What is it that we can do together? What is it that we are going to engage on as a group, as a multi-stakeholder group? And what is the pathway for us to really improve child justice across the world? So, it's the moment in which we take all this fantastic energy that the Congress has, created and put it to good use in planning, and looking ahead. So without further ado, let me first introduce a video from the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, which has Agnes Cynthia Amoding, the UN Pathfinders youth activist from Uganda, and Maike de Langen, Program Lead Justice for All, Pathfinders for Peaceful, Justice, Inclusive Societies, which showcases a presentation by the Pathfinders on the Sustainable Development Goal 16 plus and the call to action on justice for children with our partner and UN sister agency UNICEF. The video will tell you about, real importance of participating and empowering young people and children in access to justice across the globe. So, please, let's see this beautiful video.
My name is Maike de Lange and I lead the justice work with the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. The Pathfinders is a group of countries, organizations and people working to achieve SDG 16. We work together to reduce inequality and exclusion, to prevent all forms of violence and to provide equal access to justice for all. Justice with children and justice for children has always been a part of our work for justice for all. We partnered with a group of organizations who are working in this area, and in 2019 we launched a call to action on justice for children. It's the same group of organizations that are behind this World Congress on Justice with Children, and it is our pleasure to continue to partner with them to make this a reality. Young people around the world are leading and working for justice in their communities. They are taking initiatives, they are speaking up, they are organizing for more fairness in their schools, in their organizations, in their society. This is not only for their own benefit, but for society as a whole, and we value their perspectives and inputs into our work. It is therefore my great pleasure to present to you Agnes Cynthia Amoding, who will do an exciting announcement on behalf of the Pathfinders. She is a justice leader in her own right, and we're very happy to have her make this announcement.
My name is Amoding Agnes Cynthia, one of the Next Generation Fellows at UN Foundation. I come from Uganda. From my experience working with boys and girls, I know the value of ensuring the voices and participation of children in changing, crafting, and building systems and spaces that affect them now and in the future, especially justice. Justice is critical in addressing the crisis of today and tomorrow. And as a Next Generation Fellow, I, along with my fellow participants, articulated to leadership that it is not our job to agree with you, and laid out clear and actionable ways to face the many crises we see today, including addressing the justice gap. Leaders, including the Secretary General, have stated that they must better incorporate the expertise of young people. That's why I'm excited to announce a new initiative by the Pathfinders, the Young Justice Leaders, a group of young leaders in the field who will work together to continue to speak out, co-create items and plans to contribute and influence the 2023 SDG Summit. Please keep an eye for more information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki, for playing the video. And it is exciting where we're looking ahead to 2023 already, so thank you. For now, I'd like to invite our session debate, bringing two of the key organizations that are, spearheading work on child justice. Kirsten DiMartino, who is Senior Child Protection Advisor and Program Division at UNICEF, and Tatiana Teplova, Head of Division Policy Coherence for the Sustainable Development Goals, Senior Counselor Gender Justice and Inclusiveness at OECD. Both UNICEF and OECD, incredibly good partners with UNESCO. So I'd like to start by welcoming both and addressing first question to Tatiana. Tatiana, with the real urgency in order to pursue child-centered justice reforms, what is it that the OECD can assist countries with in making access to justice for children a reality? Do you have actions to share with us that you would like to talk about?
Thank you so much. And maybe I'd like to start by praising the World Congress efforts in shedding light on this important topic, and of course congratulate all organizers and partners for this excellent event. And for the OECD, this is a really, really important commitment and issue. The OECD is a co-custodian of the Sustainable Development Goal 16.3 on access to justice, attaches the greatest importance to leaving no one behind. And here, of course, we see children as the most vulnerable, and we advocate the rethinking of our justice systems and strategies to really put children at the center, and in order to create the best possible conditions for children to grow and also to reach their full potential. As you've heard from our Secretary General in the opening plenary, we have been working on promoting policies on equal access to justice for children, including on addressing inequalities, overcoming barriers to access, but also tailoring justice services to really respond to the justice needs and experiences of children, be that as offenders, as victims, or as witnesses. And we are currently developing a people-centered justice framework with the adaptation to children, so a child-centered justice approach, which will include a number of key elements. And not to go through the details of this work, because of course we are short on time, but just to highlight a few pillars in general terms. First is the importance of adequate legal, policy and institutional frameworks. And we've heard about the importance of ensuring compliance of national legal frameworks frameworks with international norms, but also putting in place appropriate institutional policy and coordination mechanisms to facilitate the implementation of these norms. Then, of course, the importance of legal empowerment of children and evidence-based policy and service design and delivery. And here the emphasis really is on strengthening capacities of decision makers to effectively use evidence and integrate perspectives of children. This framework also calls for child-friendly arrangements along the justice pathways with a view to really creating conditions, but also the coordinated system of assistance, child protection, in order to prevent the risks of re-victimization that we've heard quite a few times during the past days, but also the fragmentation of services. And finally, this framework emphasizing strengthened capacity of our systems, of our justice systems to deliver on child-centered justice. And here we are talking about the importance of a multidisciplinary, specialized training for all professionals dealing with children, but also adequate resources, appropriate monitoring and evaluation systems to actually address the extent to which the justice sector is effective and meaningful in responding to the needs of children. And we are planning to undergo a wide consultation with all of the stakeholders around the globe on this framework, and we would certainly welcome the engagement and inputs of all of the participants of this Congress and beyond.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Let me now turn to Kirsten and say, you know, with the changes shown by the COVID pandemic and the historic number of children released from detention, what is it what does this number mean for the future of justice for children? You know, speaking specifically about the global data that you just released about children in detention earlier this week. What can you tell us about that?
Thank you very much, Maggie Elsa, and thank you very much for inviting me to the closing plenary of this very, very important World Congress on Justice with Children. Yes, I would like to start by saying that the COVID pandemic, as devastating as it has been for everybody, including young people, has also shown that change is more than possible, especially in the administration of justice for children. On Monday, UNICEF released new global data showing that since the start of the pandemic, more than 45,000 children have been released from detention in at least 84 countries. This is truly, truly historical. We have never seen the release of so many children on this scale. So the COVID pandemic really triggered opportunities for reform. Countries that had invested in diversion and non-custodial measures before the pandemic did not have large numbers of children in detention and were better prepared to release children and apply alternatives. Countries that introduced innovative solutions such as virtual courts and online training for justice professionals were able to maintain justice and social services despite the lockdowns, ensuring that children could still access justice. And countries where the justice system worked in an integrated manner with social services, with appropriate case management, working closely with social workers and providing the post-release support that these children needed, were able to safely release large numbers of children and prevent reoffending. So the evidence is very, very clear. It is more than possible to ensure children have access to justice, even in the midst of a global pandemic. It is even possible to end the detention of children.
This is excellent, really fantastic news. So let me turn now again to Tatiana and say, you know, there is a real need for us to listen to children, understand the kinds of experiences they have, the needs they have. So how do we ensure that children's perspectives are considered when talking about, you know, justice and access to justice?
Yes, thank you, Maria Elsa, for this question. As mentioned, At the OECD, indeed, we are strongly committed to promoting children's rights to be heard, protected, and empowered. Speaking a bit more generally, we are working with our partners to explore legal needs of different groups of people to drive more fairer and inclusive transformation of justice systems. At the same time, we still know little on the types of legal needs of children, how they are experienced, or are children, all children are aware of the potential legal needs and problems that they may be facing, how they address them, or even and actually, I would say, arguably, most importantly, how much those legal needs and problems impact daily and also future lives of children. And to help countries think through this issue of evidence and to really help close the evidence gap for the governments, the OECD is currently working on a tool that combines different sources. First, we are adapting the questionnaire that we have developed with many partners that I know are present here today in this Congress on measuring and understanding legal needs and experiences of children when they come in contact with the justice system in different capacities. Then this tool is also complemented by a triangular methodology that aims to integrate elements of the focus group discussions as well as semi-structured interviews. And we hope that it can help offer a mix of different methods that could be tailored to the different groups of children, depending on the age, depending on their background, but also children living under various conditions and circumstances, be that victims of abuse or children in detention. So we would be again happy to collaborate with all partners in also making this tool available and as useful as possible.
Thank you, Tatiana. This is really inspiring. So let me now turn to Kirsten and give her the last question of this panel. Given that UNICEF has just launched the new agenda with these 6 interconnected calls to action, what are the next steps when we really seize upon the energy and the engagement that has taken place in these World Congress discussions and in other moments in which we have been talking about access to justice for children? So, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Indeed, building on all the experience and lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and the results, the significant results we have achieved, UNICEF reimagines justice through its newly launched 10-year agenda on justice for children. This reimagined agenda was launched by UNICEF Executive Director on Monday, and indeed it calls for 6 interconnected actions. It reinforces also the call to action on justice for children of the Pathfinders on Peace, Just and Inclusive Societies, which UNICEF endorsed in 2019, together with other organizations and partners. This agenda not only reinforces, of course, states' accountability for the human rights of children, but it also recognizes that we all have a role to play to drive progress and achieve long-lasting, impactful change through much-needed justice reform. Change starts with each of us taking that next step. It starts at the individual level. First and foremost, the Reimagine agenda on justice for children calls on all of us to be much more committed and intentional in addressing discrimination in all its forms in child justice systems by actively paying greater attention to children who are overrepresented in the justice system, children with disabilities, indigenous and ethnic minority children, children discriminated against due to gender, gender identity and sexual orientation, and children on the move, amongst others. This agenda also calls on all of us to empower children and youth. And indeed, Tatiana spoke at length of the importance of legal empowerment of children and youth. And we need to especially empower children and youth with lived experiences in justice and welfare systems through legal assistance, legal rights awareness, and by including them at the forefront of these reforms as appropriate, which firmly, and this really firmly aligns with also with what we just heard in the video, where Cynthia, a UN Foundation Next Generation Fellow, spoke about the value of ensuring the voices of and participation of children. Children's legal right to be heard must be recognized and must be upheld. Most importantly, this agenda also calls to end the detention of children in all its forms. Unlawful and arbitrary detention, children in immigration detention, military detention, those detained due to national security concerns or alleged association with armed groups, and children in conflict with the law. To end detention, states must strengthen their child-friendly and gender-responsive justice systems. They need to prioritize prevention and early intervention, diversion, non-custodial measures, therapeutical approaches, post-release support, and last but not least, restorative justice. In so doing, children can still be held to account in line with international norms and standards without depriving them of their liberty and sacrificing their sense of dignity and worth. We must also devote greater efforts to victim-centered responses to child sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation to eliminate the barriers that deny children survivors justice. This includes removing, for example, statutory limitation periods and establishing redress schemes for child sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation. And finally, we need greater investments. There is a need for child-friendly and gender-responsive alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and courts. These are central to children's access to justice, ending the detention of children, and realizing children's rights to live free from violence, exploitation, and abuse. This bold vision, the UNICEF bold vision for the future on justice for children, requires us all to work together in partnership. Our session today asks the question, what is next? For UNICEF, we have the bold vision, one that cannot be achieved by us alone. It requires us to work together as partners with government, but also with children and young people to make this a reality for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I need to thank both of you, Tatiana and Kirsten, for these fantastic presentations and this Q&A. And indeed, you both touched on very important aspects. It is we do live in an unprecedented moment. There are plenty of risks and opportunities and challenges ahead of us. There is a lot of solutions also that are appearing, an opportunity for us to, to do things better with new solutions, new tools, taking into account that we all need to work together on a multi-stakeholder approach and, avoiding the one-size-fits-all solution that really looks at the children in different conditions, under different circumstances, in order to really achieve the goal 16.3. And I appreciate your fantastic remarks. And thank you very much for joining this plenary session. So thank you both. And, we'll keep on talking about this. Vijay, this is, the word is back to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria-Elsa, and all of the panelists for sharing concretely where we go from here. Congress, we are pressed for time. However, we're going to hear about another action going forward. TEDESOM has been working over the past year with the private sector and with young people to develop a tool for young people to know and understand their rights when they encounter the police. And today it is the launch of the Real Rights Project. More information about this project will soon be on the justicewithchildren.org website. However, to get started and learn some more about this project, let's watch a video about this exciting project.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gary Hunt, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Daniela Mandel and John Groom. We're here today to announce a project that we're really proud of, Real Rights, which is in short a city-by-city consolidated resource for young people globally, informing them of their rights when encountering the police and assisting them in reporting behavior that infringes upon those rights. We're excited about Real Rights, not only because of how empowering we think this resource will be, but also because there's no single global resource like Real Rights currently available that addresses this problem that young people continue to grapple with. Tragic reports are growing worldwide of the high stakes when law enforcement and security forces interact with young people, especially young people of color, young people from minority groups, and youth from vulnerable populations. We have seen the cost and the pain of interactions with the police that go wrong. We also know that for many people, there is simply a sense of unease or uncertainty when it comes to interacting with law enforcement. Whether that is caused by intentional actions or not, that is the reality for many people.
By way of example, in the United States, racial disparity is up 22% between Black and white youth since 2001. Black children make up only 16% of the youth population. However, they are 5 times more likely to be held in detention and 4 times as likely to be held in a residential treatment center. And all that is actually despite the fact that juvenile crime has been decreasing since the mid-90s.
We also need to acknowledge the challenges that children face as they confront complex legal and justice structures. Legal rights and principles can be difficult to understand, and there aren't many opportunities for young people to really learn the practical application of the law to their lives. And, children are different from adults. Their brains are still developing. That means they can't fully understand how to act in a fleeting encounter with the police or appreciate the consequences of behaving a certain way.
So bringing that all together, there is a challenge. There is an extremely important gap. There is a significant amount of young people around the world that are not equipped with the knowledge or education regarding how to deal with interactions with law enforcement.
And that's why child rights organisations in many jurisdictions asked us to build Real Rights. The Real Rights Project aims to provide young people with key information that they need to know when they interact with law enforcement, from everyday interactions with the police, potentially being stopped and questioned, what the police are allowed to do or say, all the way through to considering whether that person wants to raise a complaint against law enforcement officers or agencies and how to do so.
The way we have decided to tackle the knowledge and education gap to help better inform young people about their rights is to compile answers to a series of targeted questions in which we link to a legal source for the answer to each question. The information we're compiling is designed to be accessible to young people. This means we're pulling together information in plain language, we've targeted the information to cities, and youth will be able to access even more resources locally through links that we provide in the Real Rights deliverables. We cover questions in Real Rights along the lines of, when can the police search you? Do the police have to tell the truth? How do you know if you're under arrest? How do you file a complaint if you feel you've been mistreated? And for this complaint piece, we've targeted this down to the very city or district involved.
Our aim with this is clear. We want to be able to empower young people with information so that they know what their rights are, what the scope of the police's rights are, and what they can do if their experience with law enforcement is not a good one and doesn't respect those rights. This tool does not give legal advice. Instead, it provides references to what the law says and what the authority is for each answer. It provides practical information, like the police may search you in these circumstances, and it would not be a good idea to run, resist, or fight, for example.
This project started as an anti-racism project following the murder of George Floyd. But as we developed our work, we recognised that the need is much more broad than the US, or just racial injustice. It's global. It's about all kinds of discrimination, and it is essential. All young people need this information.
We also want to take time to acknowledge why Real Rights is needed. From my own personal perspective, this project hits very close to home and I've been fortunate to be involved with Real Rights since its inception. The unfortunate reality is that no matter how we carry ourselves, no one is 100% excused from the possibility of an encounter with law enforcement. And to the extent that there is any way to empower those on the receiving end of police encounters with clear, succinct information about their rights in these situations, the better off I feel everyone will be. Think about some of my experiences to date and the experiences of some of my close friends and family. It's hard for me to put into words how powerful it would have been to have had the knowledge and education to understand how best to respond in these situations. There's no doubt in my mind that through knowledge and education, will young people, and young people specifically of color, be able to truly begin to build up the confidence and composure that it takes to respond to police appropriately, with the end goal being that everyone should walk away from any encounter safe and being able to feel like they've understood and were able to stand by their rights. So for me, Real Rights is not only something that I've been involved in since the start because I think it's an interesting pro bono project. It's something that I've seen based on my own experience, how valuable it can be and how valuable it will be to use globally once we're able to launch the information to be accessible to youth groups and those that are advising youth worldwide.
I am a mother of two sons, ages 21 and 17. I brought them up to develop a moral compass, to know right from wrong, abide by rules and laws. But I realized that being from a minority ethnic background, this isn't enough. It isn't enough to protect them from bias and from being stereotyped. And having guidance on how to navigate situations involving law enforcement, for instance, like knowing what they can say, what they don't need to say, and how to behave. And that could make all the difference to the outcome of such situations. As a parent, I'd feel more comfortable that my sons are equipped with this knowledge, and knowing how to apply this knowledge will give them the confidence to do so each and every time. So for me, this resource is so important to young people from minority ethnic backgrounds, and is so needed. So I'd just like to say thank you.
Why Real Rights? Because knowledge is justice and justice is equal. The violation of rights received by young people around the world is frequent and is not right. Being able to give accurate information and the knowledge to be able to enforce a right is necessary to develop a society that respects and doesn't abuse those young people in situations of social vulnerability.
To support this project, Salesforce, together with Baker McKenzie and other corporations, brought together volunteers from across the world to research laws, regulations, and police procedures to develop this resource. I have participated in several of these volunteer sessions, and I see tremendous value in empowering young people by equipping them with important information and education on their rights when they interact with the police and law enforcement. It's also very rewarding and fun for volunteers. It's a great way to connect virtually with colleagues from around the world to serve the greater good. We are just at the start of building this important resource and have a lot more work to do to take it to the finish line. Salesforce is proud to partner with the World Congress on this and hope that other corporations will join us.
We have big ambitions for this project, and we are at the very beginning of our journey. Once the legal piece is finished for many jurisdictions, we want to build out this resource so that young people everywhere in the world and the organizations and the groups that represent their interests have access to this information. We've tried to make sure that we empower young people as they interact with law enforcement with the information that they need and the legal sources behind the really contentious issues. Right now, it lives on a website that Baker McKenzie has created. But really, this project will be supercharged if we're able to produce content that young people will engage with. Content that will make sense, that is easily digestible to them, content that they'll be grabbed by. So in 2022, we also want to develop the messaging of real rights. We want to make this content as accessible as possible for young people. We plan on releasing a series of videos and storyboards to act as a hook to attract people to come and find out more. This is one coming up that some young people have already put together themselves based on some of the jurisdictions that we've completed.
Today we're answering the question, can the police arrest you if you refuse to answer their questions? For a question like this, the answer is a little bit complicated. Yes, you have the right not to speak or answer questions that a policeman may ask. But please know that if you choose not to answer questions, that this may be used as evidence against you later down the line.
Para empezar, los agentes de policía no tienen que decirle que en realidad son agentes de policía. Pueden decírselo porque su departamento de policía específico podría pedirles que lo hagan, pero no están obligados a decirlo.
We are really excited about what real rights can be, and we are hugely excited about how we can expand and develop it in 2022. We are still in the early stages of this amazing and important journey. In other words, we're still laying the groundwork. We are very grateful to all of the partners and people that have helped us thus far. Almost 1,000 volunteers are working on this now, and people have helped on this project thus far, which is excellent. We know that we will continue to need a team effort to grow and see success with the Real Rights Project, and we have hopefully stated some good reasons for a call to action throughout this presentation today.
We've got the information for 17 cities, and we've got 92 cities in progress. Of course, we can use more volunteers and resources. We're inviting partners to join us on the Real Rights Project. We recognise that what we've done so far is small. This is just the first step in empowering disadvantaged young people in their interaction with law enforcement and security forces around the world. We want to expand this project as much as we can. So if you are able to dedicate some time to getting the answers to the questions we're covering as part of Real Rights, please let us know. If your NGO or agency wants to work on this with us in your jurisdiction, please reach out to collaborate. And if you want to help us get this in the hands of young people, we want to hear from you. We'll share our contact email. Together, we can help young people in justice systems understand the real rights of children and youth in contact with the law.
Well, Congress, we have reached the end of our incredible journey today, but it does not stop here. Bringing together all of the elements from today and the past week, and to officially bring the Congress to a close, it is my privilege to introduce our organizers. Macholi Chris Bernard, representative of the Child and Youth Advisory Group, Olivia Rope, Executive Director of Penal Reform International, Marta Pascual, the President of International Association of Youth and Family Judges and Magistrates, and Sophie Barbet, the Deputy Director of Operations from TEDESOM.
Thank you, Vijaya. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World Congress on Justice with Children's closing plenary session. Only 5 days ago, we opened this global platform to exchange our experiences and learning on non-discriminatory and inclusive child justice systems to ensure access to justice for all children. Using this unique platform, the intergenerational participants at the international and regional plenaries and workshops have explored a huge range of themes. These have included good practices that enhance inclusivity and child sensitivity and access to justice for children and minimize unnecessary contact with the justice system, such as alternative forms of justice, and non-traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution. We have also heard about mechanisms for building non-discriminatory and inclusive child justice systems that eliminate discrimination on any ground for every child in the justice system, and avenues for developing child-friendly, gender-responsive, culturally and context-appropriate services, information and support that empower children in contact with the justice system. We have shared means for establishing functional, child-friendly and inclusive institutions and systems that incorporate children's effective participation. Good practices to ensure equal and equitable access to justice for all children, especially marginalized groups, and collaborative approaches to strengthen children's access to justice during crises. Finally, there have been proposals to promote training and capacity building of justice system actors in emergency and crisis planning and response in order to protect and respect the rights and voices of children in contact with the law. And also the means of investing in technology and safeguards to mitigate the negative effects of COVID-19 and other crises, bearing in mind the digital divide and other barriers that hinder access to justice. And so I will pass it over to you, Marta, to tell us about the next steps.
Thank you. Now we have nearly reached the conclusion of another World Congress on Justice with Children, one with a record number of attendees, more than 4,700, which is an impressive amount of people. We are pleased to announce that the joint efforts of participants from across all the world and regions has recruited today in the adoption of the 2021 Global Declaration on Justice with Children. The declaration highlights the voices of children and youth as exemplified by the outstanding presentation by the Child and Youth Advisory Group of the World Congress. It draws upon the experiences and wisdom of the children and youth in recognizing the systemic issues that lead children and youth into contact with the law, included intergenerational discrimination and economic inequity, family violence and abuse, exclusion from educational opportunity, failure to prioritize children's rights, and criminal justice system with focus on punishment and blame rather than support reintegration and restorative justice. The declaration embraces the notion that true realization of justice with children, both today and tomorrow, requires children and adults to work hand in hand as collaborators to achieve equal, non-discriminatory, and inclusive access to justice for all children around the world. Children must take their rightful seat at the table, and this is especially true of groups of children in contact with the law who are often excluded from discussions due to discrimination, marginalization, vulnerability, and their individual circumstances. The 2021 Global Declaration also fosters inclusive access to justice for children without discrimination by championing the development and utilization of age-appropriate, disability-inclusive, gender-responsive, and needs and rights-based justice procedures and facilities for all children in contact with the law. It is crucial upon communities who possess invaluable local knowledges to lead the way in implementing services and non-custodial measures in a non-discriminatory and inclusive manner. At the same time, data collection and assessment efforts must be strengthened in order to reverse long-standing overrepresentation of indigenous, minority, and marginalized children in the justice children, and to develop properly informed, effective, and sustainable intervention. Appropriate, adequate, and equitable investment of time and resources, and the proper capacity building of all relevant stakeholders that come into contact with children are integral to secure high-level political commitment toward non-discriminatory and inclusive child justice system and equal access to justice for children. Sophie, would you like to proceed and present how the declaration will be promoted?
Thank you, Marta. I think I will pass it to Matoli, no? Now. If you don't mind.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you too. I'm grateful that you have gathered here virtually from different parts of the world, starting from 15th November up to now, under the theme of ensuring access to justice for all children towards non-discriminatory and inclusive justice system. It's time for all of us to do the best job. We all have only one job in this life, and that is to be great ancestors. If we work hard to end the various forms of injustices and discrimination, history will remember us boldly, and the future generation will live to the happiness secured by us. Congratulations to all of us who have attended the various sessions. Special thanks to all. And special thanks to organizers, partners, and technical supporters to make the first ever virtual conference a big success. And lastly, special thanks for allowing the Congress involve children. I can't skip the great work done by with the child and advisory group. Thank you. And lastly, I invite you tomorrow to join the Child Rights Festival as we celebrate the Children's Day. Pass over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Terre des Hommes and the International Child Rights Institute, it is a great honor for me to be with you today. The 2021 Global Declaration promotes the adoption of a legal and policy basis for innovative and resilient justice processes and procedures for children in the face of crisis and pandemics. Virtual courts, hearings, interview, and case and information management should be implemented in a manner that guarantees procedural safeguards, complements in-person hearings and procedures, and provides due consideration of a child's accessibility, inclusivity, security, privacy, and confidentiality, as well as their consent and comfort level. The development of procedural guarantees and safeguards for children in contact with digital justice will be one of the main priorities for the Global Initiative on Justice with Children for 2022. In addition, during times of pandemics and other emergencies, key bodies within child protective and justice systems must be prioritized to assure that every child receives the services they need and deserve. Lastly, the declaration encourages the detection of multidisciplinary approaches in access to justice for children, which minimize children's unnecessary contact with justice system and provide child-friendly access to justice for all children in contact with the law. This will include accessible mental health and psychological support to help children and their families to cope, adapt, and transform. It will also include social protection arrangements and services which minimize risks of offending behavior and enable children to live a childhood free of violence and undue vulnerabilities. Priority must be placed on restorative justice, diversion, rehabilitation, and reintegration for all children in contact with the law through comprehensive, coordinated, and tailored case management approaches. As highlighted earlier, during the presentation of the 2 strategic foresight scenarios, we need to create new partnerships and reinforce those existing to mitigate growing harms to children through new collaboration-based advocacy mechanisms at global level. The Global Initiative on Justice with Children needs each of you to create from 2022 this global movement of professionals and experts, all determined to work together to promote fair child justice systems all over the world. As we have demonstrated through this World Congress, with the participation of policymakers, academics, NGOs, children themselves, and the corporate sector, child justice is a matter for all of us. From December 2021, the Global Declaration on Justice with Children will be translated into 40 languages and will become one of the most widely accessible child justice tools on earth. These are essential achievements which will lead to strategic way forwards. So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on that note and prior ending this incredible week, let me thank the organizing team for having made this event possible. I would like to thank Cedric and his team, Mariana, Carolina, Lucy, and Michael, who have worked hard to organize more than 100 sessions and welcome around 700 speakers throughout the week. I would also like to thank Angela and her incredible network of volunteers, our regional coordinators and focal points, as well as our partners, the Mexican Supreme Court, UNICEF, UNSRSGVAC, UNODC, OHCHR, OECD, Pathfinders on SDG 16. And a special thanks to our scientists and honorific committee members. So now I declare this the end of yet another highly successful World Congress. But as all of us know, as the 2021 World Congress closes, our work has just begun. So let's get to it. Thank you very much. And I wish you also a good weekend.
Thank you so much, Sophie and the others. As we end today, let's take a moment to look at the work of our amazing artist in residence, Katie, and her work will be available on the website after today. And please remember that the Declaration of the World Congress on Justice with Children is open for endorsement on the website. Thank you to each and every one of you who have joined us today and over the past week. And from me, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Thank you.